benefit the American public for the next generation. A great deal of activity is well underway across Reclamation as we prepare to implement the law. We are establishing a team to lead implementation and develop a plan that outlines how Reclamation will implement the law. These information sessions are designed to inform you and address your questions. We'll provide updates today that address our mission areas. Topics will include water storage and conveyance, small storage and groundwater, and aquifer storage and source substitution. We plan on addressing as many questions as possible during the question and answer period. Updated information about Reclamation's implementation of the law is always available at usbr.gov/BIL, BIL. And feel free to submit your questions or comments to usbr.bil, BIL@usbr.gov, and we'll work to address your questions. We also have a growing list of frequently asked questions, and we hope that you find that a helpful resource. We're committed to transparency throughout this process and appreciate your support of this historic opportunity to improve our nation's infrastructure, water infrastructure. At this time, it is my honor to welcome Commissioner Camille Kalimlin-Tootin for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Manning, and good afternoon to all. Thank you again for joining us today. The holiday season certainly came early for the Bureau of Reclamation and the enactment of the historic bipartisan infrastructure law. Within that law is $8.3 billion for investments in infrastructure across the reclamation service area, so across the West. And we look forward to continuing our conversation from last week's stakeholder sessions to focus on several other provisions within the law that we'll get into more details with today. First, I'd like to thank my colleagues on Team Reclamation for the work that they're doing in implementing this law. And thank you for your partnership and your engagement with us as we work through getting this money out and really putting some yellow trucks out there for us. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Mr. Chris Beardsley, Director of Policy and Programs.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good afternoon, everyone. As the Commissioner mentioned, I am Chris Beardsley. I'm the Director of Reclamation's Policy and Programs Group here in Denver. Under my portfolio, I oversee 5 different divisions, including our Design, Estimating, and Construction Oversight Office, our Preparedness and Security Divisions, our Environmental Compliance Division, and most applicable to today's topic, our Reclamation Law Administration Division. Within the Reclamation Law Administration Division, 2 areas we focus on are 1, contracts and repayment, and 2, planning and economics. And both these areas relate heavily to today's topics. Now, as we noted in last week's stakeholder session, if you were able to attend that one, Reclamation has a legacy of historic engineering and construction achievements, and our infrastructure ranges from the geographically small to wonders of the modern world. Therefore, it is our honor to be involved in Reclamation's implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Through the infrastructure law, policy and programs, and I should say specifically the Reclamation Law Administration Division with assistance from the Environmental Compliance Division, we'll be providing leadership related to many different sections in this historic piece of legislation. And furthermore, we will be utilizing as many existing programmatic and process structures as possible to reduce unnecessary burdens and find efficiencies. We look forward to engaging you along the way and closely collaborating with individuals in Reclamation's 5 regions and Reclamation's leadership team as well to ensure we are successful in our efforts. With that, I'd like to introduce Carrie Doral, who is a program analyst in our Planning and Economics group. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes, Carrie will provide information related to Section 40902 of the bill, and that's related to water storage and conveyance. Section 40903 related to small surface water and groundwater storage. And then Section 40910 related to aquifer storage and source substitution. Carrie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to share this information with you today. As Director Beardsley said, I'm going to be presenting about a few sections of the bipartisan infrastructure legislation. And the first would be our surface groundwater storage and water conveyance programs, of which the bipartisan infrastructure legislation establishes two, a continued funding source for previously authorized storage projects, as well as a competitive grant program for small surface and groundwater storage projects. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the first program that I would like to share with you all today is found in section 40902 of the bill, and that is for surface water storage, groundwater storage, and conveyance projects. The law authorizes $1.05 billion from fiscal years 2022 to 2026 for certain water storage and conveyance projects. To be eligible for funding consideration under this section, there must be a previously authorized feasibility study or construction project, and that does include any storage projects that were named under Section 4007 of the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act of 2016 that actually just expired. This section requires that for an eligible project to receive construction funding, the Secretary of the Interior has to determine that project to be technically and financially feasible, that in return for the federal investment in the project, a proportionate share of the benefits are federal benefits. You can think of these as net gains to the nation as a whole. If you are at all familiar with a lot of Reclamation's traditional project purposes, those categories can include fish and wildlife enhancement, recreation, water supply, etc. The Secretary also has to find the project both to be in the public interest, as well as recommend it for construction funding. That funding is reimbursable where it is required by reclamation law. For cost sharing, the law divides projects into non-federal and federally owned. Non-federal projects are eligible for up to 25% investment, while federally owned projects are eligible for up to 50% federal investment, and that's in relation to total project cost. Any previously authorized feasibility studies will be cost shared per authorizing legislation or reclamation policy, which is a 50-50 cost share. Next slide, please. So the next program I'm going to talk about is found in section 40903, and this is a new competitive grant program that Reclamation will be implementing for what the law calls small water storage and groundwater storage projects. The law authorizes $100 million from fiscal years 2022 to 2026. And the way that this section defines small is projects with a storage capacity, a water storage capacity of not below 2,000 acre feet and not to exceed 30,000 acre feet. It allows for two types of projects, those that increase surface water or groundwater storage, and those projects that convey water directly or indirectly to or from surface or groundwater storage facilities within those capacity restrictions. In order to receive grants for the planning, design, and construction of these projects, non-federal project sponsors will submit a completed small storage feasibility studies for review by Reclamation. The guidelines for these small storage feasibility studies will be issued in early 2022. However, the law does lay out some specific requirements I would want to share with you all. The first is that the Secretary has to determine the project complies with those guidelines that will be issued. And then the Secretary has to determine the project to be technically and financially feasible, that it provides a federal benefit, and that sufficient non-federal funding is available to complete the project. The law also directs Reclamation to give priority to projects that are likely to provide more reliable water supply for states, Indian tribes, and local governments, are likely to increase water management flexibility, are regional in nature, have multiple stakeholders, and or provide multiple benefits. Cost sharing under this authority is required by law, and awards are up to 25% of total project costs, not to exceed $30 million for any individual project. We'll be really looking at this grant program as a way to help Reclamation meet the President's Justice 40 initiative. That's outlined in Executive Order 14008, called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. And that sets a goal for federal agencies to deliver 40% of the benefits from investments in the development of critical clean water infrastructure, among other categories, to disadvantaged communities. For this program, we would anticipate issuing a funding opportunity announcement, likely in late 2022. But again, you'll see guidelines in early 2022 to begin formulation of those small storage feasibility studies. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last program that I'm going to talk about today is in section 40910, which the bipartisan infrastructure legislation does not explicitly provide funding for. However, what this section does is establish Reclamation's authority and requirements for providing technical and or financial assistance for what the law calls groundwater recharge, aquifer storage and recovery, or water source substitution for aquifer protection projects. The Secretary of the Interior, at the request of and in coordination with any affected Indian tribes, states, or any public agency organized pursuant to state law, may provide technical and financial assistance for those types of projects. Requirements of the law for a project to receive financial assistance funding for construction are that it must follow the requirements set out in section 40902 that I talked about initially, which state that the Secretary must find the project or must determine the project to be technically and financially feasible, that in return for the federal investment, in the project, at least a proportionate share of those benefits are federal benefits. The Secretary has to find the project to be in the public interest, as well as recommend it for construction funding. And just like under 40902, this funding will be reimbursable where required by reclamation law. Importantly, a project with a total estimated cost of $500 million under this section is only eligible for construction funding if the project is authorized for construction by an act of Congress. Technical assistance under this authority is going to follow our standard processes at Reclamation when requesting such assistance. Finally, cost sharing requirements under this section also follow those of section 40902 for water storage projects. And that means non-federal projects are eligible for up to 25% federal investment, and federally owned projects are eligible for up to 50% federal investment, again, in relation to that total cost. With that, I will thank you all for your time today, and I'm going to turn things back over to our Policy and Programs Director, Beardsley, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Carrie, for that presentation. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the following individuals. I'd like to thank Matt Mossieri and Beth Hughes Brown, who are serving as the co-leads for the infrastructure law implementation across Reclamation. I'd like to thank Rob Manning and Peter Soth within our Public Affairs group, and Melissa Smith in our Program and Budget Office, who helped greatly in putting this particular session together. I'd I'd also like to thank the team in policy and programs who have been working extremely hard over the past few months in anticipation of this law being passed. And we did that so that we may be efficient and effective in the infrastructure law's implementation. And lastly, I'd like to thank Commissioner Tootin for her comments and her valuable leadership as we take on this monumental effort. We know how important this is to you, and I'd like to assure you that this is just as important to us. So we'll now have time for your questions, and for that portion of the program, Carrie Doral will also be joined by Carl Stock, who is the manager of the Reclamation Law Administration Division. I am truly lucky enough to work with Carrie and Carl on a daily basis, and I'm continually in awe of their collective expertise. But first, to get more details about the logistics of the question and answer session, I will now hand the mic over to Rob Manning, who will also be joined by Peter Soth in the moderation. Rob?
Thank you, Mr. Beardsley, and thanks to all of our presenters. At this time, we will address your questions about how Reclamation will implement the bipartisan infrastructure law. Please raise your hand using the hand icon at the top of your screen and state your name and affiliation when asking a question. Or you can submit a question by sending an email to usbr.bil@usbr.gov. And again, we're committed to addressing as many questions as we can during this limited time today. With that, let's get to your questions. Peter?
We have a question from chat from Mark Limbaugh. How would the capacity of a small groundwater storage project be calculated?
Thanks for the question. So again, a lot of some of that information will be in our guidance that we're issuing in early 2022. I think we tend to think of net increases in water storage capacity created by a project. However, that section does also talk about conveyance projects that would be eligible. And there we'd be looking to that conveyance directly, indirectly to or from is related to a storage facility within those capacity restrictions.
Thank you, Carrie. Someone let us know that there is an issue with downloading the slides from this presentation. We're working on that now, and hopefully we'll have it updated before we're done today. Ian Lyle, can you please unmute your mic and share your affiliation?
Yes, sir. Peter, thank you very much. Thank you to you, Ian Lyle, National Water Resources Association. Thanks to you, Mr. Torpy and Mr. Manning and Commissioner Tootin for the presentation today. I know you guys have a lot that you're rolling out. I was wondering, and this might be a question for Mr. Beardsley or Carrie. Can you clarify the repayment provisions? You mentioned that project funding would be subject to repayment if it was allowed under reclamation law. Would that be if a contractor has an existing repayment contract with reclamation on a project that would be subject to those same terms, or would it be subject to new terms based on different reclamation authorities? So how would the repayment obligations be determined, and how would they be at what rate would they be set? Would it be on contract by contract basis, I guess, is what I'm kind of trying to clarify.
I can take that one, Ian. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Mr. Stock.
Absolutely. So our read of it is that the 75%, 25% in the case of non-federal and 50-50 in the case of federally owned ones is a limitation on federal investment, which is distinct from reimbursability. So those numbers limit what reclamation can advance for the project versus what has to be advanced by the non-federal entities. But the reimbursement, when it says it's in accordance with reclamation law, we would look at the purposes to which the water goes. So in cases where the federal investment covers water supply to irrigation or M&I, it would be reimbursable in accordance with the terms of reimbursement for irrigation and M&I. If the federal investment is covering purpose that is non-reimbursable under reclamation law, such as flood control in most cases, then there wouldn't be any reimbursement associated with that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ian. Greg Sachs, if you could unmute yourself and share your affiliation.
Hello, thank you all. My name is Greg Sachs. I'm with Pima County, Arizona, particularly the Flood Control District. And I'm wondering, for local jurisdictions such as counties or municipalities looking to partner potentially with tribes or each other, where's the best place to look for the breakdown between programmatic and existing grant funding opportunities and new avenues specifically related to the bill?
Peter, I'm fine to take a crack at that if you would like.
Sure.
Hi, Greg, Matt Mostieri from Reclamation. Great thing about our organization as far as in regional offices and area offices, we have a pretty good dispersed knowledge base in area offices and regional offices that are responsible for those direct relationships with tribes and contractors, water and power organizations, NGOs. Our contacts at the area office level are oftentimes great liaisons to program offices. So if there are questions about programmatic versus specifically authorized, very targeted programs, your area and regional offices are a great starting point for those. Also, for the programs with specific funding opportunities, our website, like WaterSmart, for example, section on our website, will usually list human being contacts with actual direct phone numbers and direct emails. So between those two, I would recommend using those. And then a third line, hit us up on the email address that's on our webpage for the infrastructure law. It's linked directly from our homepage. So between those three options, you should be able to get somebody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sachs. Kate Ely, please unmute yourself and share your affiliation.
Hi, sorry, it took me a little bit of time. I don't know if my camera is here. Yeah, so I have a question related to groundwater storage. I'm wondering if drilling and construction of monitoring wells qualify under the BIL funds, if groundwater is the sole source of water for domestic, community, municipal, and irrigation uses in a region with known groundwater overdraft.
Thanks for your question. I think that we would want to have maybe some more project-specific discussion with you. But I also, I'm thinking along the lines of section 40910 for the financial assistance for groundwater recharge, aquifer storage and recovery, and water source substitution for aquifer protection projects, and how exactly those projects would be characterized and whether yours would fit. But I think that, we're really looking at how those projects can comply with those required determinations, that it's technically financially feasible, et cetera. And could you characterize what your project is as one of those type of projects is a question I think we should explore further in a follow-up conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Matt, I'm going to direct a question to you. We had a question about the President's Interagency Drought Task Force. Can you ask who's leading that, or and how to contact the task force?
Sure. Yeah, I saw the question in the chat. It's a good question. That task force has carried over from last year, and it is still active. Interior is an active participant on that. Our Assistant Secretary has been active on it. I saw the question for a specific staff level contact, and honestly, I was going to ask if we could reply for the record on that because I'm not sure who the latest is, but I can confirm that Reclamation and Interior through our Assistant Secretary's office are active and represented in the task force that continues to meet. So if I could get a reply for the record, that'd be great, unless Camille has something. I see it came on camera. If you have a later.
Thanks, Matt. I will say I am personally engaged in the task force. It's co-chaired by USDA and our Assistant Secretary, Tanya Trujillo, so USDA and Interior. But yes, we can provide more information on the record.
Thank you, Camille.
Can I just say one thing? Mike Orcutt, you had a question earlier. I don't know if your question's already been resolved, but if it hasn't, we're happy to take it.
And again, feel free to submit your questions or comments to usbr.bil@usbr.gov, and we'll make sure we work to address your questions. And as mentioned, we do have a growing list of frequently asked questions, and we hope that's a helpful resource. We'll continue to build that.
And just a reminder, this is listening session number 2. The first listening sessions occurred last week. They discussed and covered dam safety, water smart grants, water recycling, drought contingency plans, multi-benefit projects to improve watershed health, and desalination. So you can watch those presentations on our website, usbr.gov/bill, as Rob has mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Peter. And we will hold for about 10-15 seconds to see if we have any more questions.
I have a question for Carrie.
Okay.
Could you please restate the potential funding sources for 40910, 40910 opportunities, and are these likely to be competitive grant opportunities if made available?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to clarify. I can go through just each section really quickly as well to reaffirm. Section 40902, that's our sort of larger water storage projects. That is a program that's not managed like a grant. We allocate funding annually through an internal process. Because Section 40910 is subject to a lot of the requirements of 40902. We'll also be managing that in a similar process. So it will be an internal process. Generally, what that looks like is we ask regional offices to submit projects they'd like to see funded. We assess those for eligibility against the requirements of the law, and our leadership makes funding allocation determinations based on agency goals, administration priorities, and the specific capabilities of the projects themselves. The only grant program that we will be implementing of the programs I've talked about today is under Section 40903 for those small service and groundwater storage projects.
We have a question from another question from Ian Lyle again. Ian, feel free to unmute yourself now.
Oh, thank you, Peter, and taking the opportunity to ask a second question, if that's okay. Appreciate the time. I think Carrie was talking a little bit about Section 40903, and I had a question about that. I think in the initial conversation you mentioned that you'd be looking at the Justice 40 initiative as a metric for prioritizing funding underneath that section. I was curious how that would be looked at as water managers are starting to try to figure out how to apply for these different opportunities. I think I could be wrong. I think Justice 40 talks a little bit about water conservation and things like that, less on the supply side. So I was curious how those two things would be married together. And happy to have a set up an offline meeting if that's easier.
Sure. I think that the Justice 40 guidance and implementation is still being determined, by the department and by the administration. That being said, we see this as an opportunity to help us advance that goal. It's not to say that this program will be solely based on those Justice 40 sort of initiatives, especially because we know we're going to have some really project-specific criteria to help lay out. But we would be looking at, who benefits from these projects as sort of a, potential criteria.
Okay, so it's a part of the criteria. It's not a requirement. Is that fair?
I think it could be part of the criteria, right? We're still trying to establish what that criteria looks like. But I think that we see it as a valuable opportunity for us to advance that goal, if at all possible.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I have another question in chat from Mark Limbaugh. If a small surface storage, i.e. a regulating storage facility, creates through conservation more water storage than the specific capacity of the facility itself, will that count towards the eligibility requirements of the small storage provisions? Would this be covered in the guidance?
Sure, thanks for the question. I think that we would probably say we'd separate the conservation component from the facility or infrastructure component, and therefore that those additional conservation measures wouldn't count against the total. But happy to talk more, and hopefully that will be clarified in some of our guidance that would be issued, at least to assess, to begin preparing a small storage feasibility study under that section.
It's Sandra O'Farrell. Please unmute yourself and share your affiliation.
Hi, Sandy O'Farrell, Laco Associates. I'm actually going to ask Greg Sachs's question from the chat because I'm very curious about this. Is there a synopsis of programmatic versus grant funds?
This is Matt from Reclamation. I think we've probably got that text somewhere. I don't have it at hand. Carl, I see your camera on. If you had a better answer than that, have at it.
I wanted to make sure we understood the question of separating programmatic funds from grant funds. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what exactly you're looking for. Are you asking maybe whether, what we're doing through a competitive grant process versus an internal funding allocation?
Yes.
Okay. So as Carrie mentioned, section 40902, funding under that section, we will handle as an internal allocation process. Whereas section 40903, the small water storage projects, those were specifically directed to handle as a competitive grant process. So for those, that latter category, we'll put out a funding opportunity announcement with a set of criteria against which projects will be specifically ranked. And for 40902, the larger projects, that will be an internal allocation process based on expressions of interest from eligible entities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandy. Bill McDonald, please unmute yourself and share your affiliation.
Did that work? Apparently it did. Bill McDonald, McDonald Water Policy Consulting, representing a couple of clients. The act, of course, requires that you provide a spending plan for 22, 60 days after enactment. I just wondered what exactly is that deadline, and do you expect to do it any sooner than 60 days?
All right, this is Beth Hughes Brown, and we are going to do it right on time. January 14th is the date.
Okay.
It's in the works, as you might expect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I have a question from David Ortman. How will the principles and guidelines for water projects be applied under PL 117-58?
Sure. So what I think that David is referring to is our executive level planning guidance for implementation studies, and the principles and guidelines from 1983 were updated in 2015 and replaced with the principles, requirements, and guidelines. Not a huge name shift there, but it is a different document. So I would definitely refer you to the 2015 guidance that is issued. How we implement that at Reclamation is in our planning program, and you know, the principles, requirements, and guidelines talk about thresholds for scaled and standard analyses. Under sections 40902 and 40903, we would expect feasibility analysis consistent with the standard level of analysis that is in the principles, requirements, and guidelines, and consistent with our feasibility studies policy at Reclamation, which is CMP 0902. And then for the grant program, we are still determining how exactly the Secretary can concur with the technical and financial feasibility of those smaller projects, and how entities could formulate studies to meet those requirements such that the Secretary can concur.
Thank you, Carrie. Peter, any more hands raised out there?
No more hands raised. We just had a question about the WaterSmart presentations available to download. The PowerPoint that was used last week for the meeting, for the listening sessions last week, is available on our website, as Rob has provided on the link. I do not have any more questions at this time, Rob.
Okay. Let's give it a few more seconds to see if anyone has any additional questions. Okay, well, we sure appreciate your time today, and thank you for your very insightful questions, and many thanks to all of our subject matter experts. Hold on, we got one that just came in, right?
Yeah, the question about the spin plan on January 14th, does it apply to all program areas?
See if we can address that one real quick.
Yeah, this is Beth again. It will address all program areas. The ones that are new perhaps won't get funding in the earliest years, since the programs themselves are not completely in the earliest year, since the programs themselves are not completely developed. But more will be revealed on that very soon. As soon as we know it, you folks will know it.
Thank you so much, Beth. Any additional questions? Okay. Well, again, on behalf of the Bureau of Reclamation, thank you. Thank you for attending today's information session. We're dedicated to transparency throughout the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Our next brief, that is tailored to address stakeholder interest, is scheduled for Friday, January 7th, 2022 at 3 p.m. Eastern. That's Friday, January 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Please go to usbr.gov/BIL, BIL, for the list of all scheduled sessions, the topics covered in those briefs, and updated information. And this session will be available for viewing at usbr.gov/BIL, as indicated on the slide there. Again, thank you for your partnership and your support. Happy holidays.